18 months into the Ukraine conflict, are sanctions putting any pressure on the Kremlin? When Vladimir Putin launched his invasion, European governments pledged to cut their reliance on Russian gas, while big brands promised to pull out in protest. But have efforts to defang the Russian bear had any bite? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the impact of sanctions. When the Soviet Union collapsed back in the early 90s, companies around the world considered Russia a sort of Wild West for business. The U.S. fast food giant McDonald's was quick to open its first restaurant, giving record-breaking crowds a taste of Western culture. But fast forward 30 years, and Russia invades Ukraine. That Wild West is now under heavy sanctions, and McDonald's has left, selling more than 800 stores and writing off $1 billion in losses. Now, Western governments have scrambled to implement new rules to isolate President Putin and weaken the Russian economy. But cutting off the Kremlin hasn't been that easy. According to the Kiev School of Economics, only 241 Western companies have fully exited Russia out of more than 3,000 surveyed. The majority of businesses are committed to keeping their Russian interests. Last year, foreign companies paid $3.5 billion in taxes to Moscow. U.S. tobacco company Philip Morris raked in the most revenue at $7.8 billion, followed closely by Swiss-based Japan Tobacco International and French DIY retailer Leroy Merlin. Pepsi comes in fourth. Despite stopping the local production of beverages, it's now selling other products, but you can still buy Coca-Cola in Russia. It's rebranded as Dobry Cola and is bottled by a Greek-owned firm. U.S. firms top the list of countries working in Russia, paying more than $700 million in taxes to the Kremlin. German companies follow with over $400 million, and Swiss-based firms contributed $275. The World Bank says Russia's economy has weakened, but far less than expected. GDP dropped by 2.1% last year, but the IMF forecasts growth of 0.7% for 2023. Well, European governments scrambled to wean themselves off Russian energy following the invasion, and President Putin cut gas pipelines in response. But that has not stopped EU countries from receiving record values of liquefied natural gas through shipping. Shipped imports have actually increased 40% since the Ukraine war began. The EU is Russia's biggest customer, with Belgium and Spain the second and third biggest buyers after China.
Buying Russian gas has the same impact as buying Russian oil. Both fund the war in Ukraine, and every euro means more bloodshed. While European countries decry the war, they are putting money into Putin's pockets.
But Western companies still in Russia don't just have to navigate international sanctions. They're now also dealing with an increasingly hostile Kremlin. The Russian state has imposed punitive discounts and taxes on foreign companies looking to sell and exit. Recently, French yogurt maker Danone and Danish brewer Carlsberg saw President Putin nationalize their assets. Both companies had been finalizing sales of their Russian interests to local buyers. Meanwhile, a number of studies have looked into the effect of sanctions on Russia and on companies working there. A recent one is called the lucrative business of staying, corporate foreign enablers of the Kremlin's war. Joining me now to share her perspective on that report is Ellie Nichol. She is the spokesperson for the pro-Kiev NGO Before Ukraine, who published the study, and she joins me now from London. Thanks so much for being with us, Ellie. You have been able to identify the foreign companies actually profiting from continuing to work in Russia. There's a pretty serious list of offenders here. And just today, actually, the Ukrainian government listed Mars and PepsiCo as actual sponsors of war. Explain how they're profiting from being in Russia now, and why would it be worth staying?
Sure. So sanctions, simply put, only apply to certain sections of the economy. Those sections of the economy that aren't covered by sanctions, it's up to the businesses themselves to decide whether they stay or whether they go. We saw at the outbreak of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that many businesses did the right thing and took the courageous decision to leave Russia. However, our study shows that in 2022, up to today, the majority of businesses, well over half, have decided to stay.
Do you have any sympathy then for the companies who'd actually made huge investments in Russia pre-sanctions that are now finding it actually just too expensive to leave? And then some argue they got trapped because suddenly Putin nationalized a lot of their assets. They are forced to pay taxes, they may argue. Is there a case to be made for them, or did they have a chance and you believe they selfishly did not take the opportunity to do the right thing?
Well, the writing's been on the wall in Russia for quite some time, not just from the full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022, but from 9 years before that when Russia illegally invaded Crimea. So companies have had well over 9 years to assess the political situation and do what's expected of them under international human rights law, which is to carry out heightened human rights due diligence to judge whether their business operations in Russia are contributing to the risk of conflict and human rights abuses, and to take steps to mitigate against that. The companies that have stayed after the invasion, the vast majority have failed to take those steps. They did have an opportunity to leave shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, but they chose not to do so. The other thing to mention here actually is our research shows that actually the average revenue created in Russia by these companies is around 2.4% of global revenue. So yes, it is a hit, but it's a fairly incremental one for the vast majority of companies, and one that could be easily recouped if they were to, say, position themselves better in other markets.
Okay. It's interesting because one of the other issues your organization has tried to make some light of is that the Biden administration in the U.S. has not issued a business advisory for Russia. He's done so for Myanmar, Hong Kong, South Sudan. There's a list of others. And given his position on Ukraine, it would seem the most obvious thing to do. So why hasn't he listed Russia?
Yeah, you're right. It is an odd and glaring omission in the Biden administration policy toolkit. Publicly, when asked about this, the administration states that they can't tell companies what they can and cannot do outside of export controls and sanctions. But that's not actually what a business advisory would do either.
Right.
A business advisory is exactly what it says. It's advice to business about what the risks are and how to mitigate against them. And it also helps their investors and shareholders ask pertinent questions as well. Judging from the news today of Pepsi and Mars being blacklisted effectively by Ukraine as international sponsors of war, it seems that even the best and most well-resourced of US brand names could do with some advice.
Right. Okay, Ellie, we're going to have to follow up on this at sometime in the near future and see if they do heed that advice and where these investments in Russia go on behalf of very well-known, popular Western companies. But we'll have to leave it there for now. I'd like to thank you so much for being with us. Greatly appreciated. So let's broaden out the discussion and ask our panel if sanctions are working or perhaps even backfiring. Well, joining me to debate that are from Lviv, Ukraine, Svitlana Romanko. She is the founder and director at Razom We Stand. From Moscow, Viktor Olevich. He's the lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics, a Moscow-based think tank. And from Berlin, Ben Aris. He is the editor-in-chief and founder of BNE, IntelliNews, and Newspace. Thanks all so much for being with us. Svitlana, Ukraine is, I guess, disappointed at best with the impact sanctions have had on not just not punishing Putin, but stopping the actual war. So what really has gone wrong, in your opinion?
I think, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today, and I will try to speak on behalf of Ukrainians. So we are not disappointed. We are paying the highest toll imaginable for each day of enriching the fossil fuel dictatorship regime in Russia that is still able to wage the war against us. And just bringing a few key numbers, I wanted to stress that even now, Russian revenue from fossil fuels, after imposing the different sanctions, which we can talk in particular, it has halved, but also exceeds 400 billion euros, and loopholes in existing sanctions still allow money to flow to Russia. And Russia has lost roughly about 99 billion in imports and 53 billion in European Union exports, but also EU imports of Russian liquefied natural gas.
Right. We cited some of those statistics at the top of the program. I mean, who do you blame for this?
We can't say we blame, but we appeal to the Western countries to impose appropriate measures to fully sanction Russian terrorist regime. First, this is the oil price cap coalition for just increase for totally banning Russian oil from the market, not just letting it flow in the form of oil price cap. And the second, we really apply to and try to appeal to the European Union Commission and Council and try to get them on board with imposing the full ban on Russian LNG.
Okay, let me ask Ben quickly if you think Svitlana's suggestions there could actually work.
I mean, work in the sense that, you know, you would scupper the Russian budget if you removed all of its oil exports completely. But that's actually built in, baked into the sanctions not to do that, because the fear here behind she mentioned the oil price cap, and the idea of that was to reduce the amount of money that the Kremlin can earn from exporting oil, but to keep the oil flowing, because what the West is terrified of, if you take the Russian exports, whatever it is, 5 million barrels a day off the market, then you would have a massive shortage, and oil prices around the world would spike. I mean, the highest they've ever got is about 150, and JP Morgan released a note saying that we've got $350, and that would cause a worldwide economic crisis if you had oil prices that high. So the sanctions are sort of fundamentally compromised in so much as, on the one hand, you're trying to reduce the amount of money that the Kremlin gets with the oil price cap, and at the other time, you want to keep the volume of oil going into the market the same. And unfortunately, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And as Svitlana mentioned, you know, there's been a lot of cheating, there's a lot of leakage, because it's an enormously sophisticated worldwide market. And so it's been very easy for Russia. It's, you know, Europe's banned the import of Russian oil and oil products, but it's been very easy for Russia simply to send that oil to India, China, where it's refined, and then it's shipped back all the way to Europe. And we buy it here in Europe as Indian oil, petrol, but it's not. It's Russian oil. It's just been refined somewhere else. And this is what everyone's struggling with now.
I mean, is that effect of cheating, is it legal?
It's legal. It's absolutely legal.
Is it really, though? Because that's, I mean, the United States in particular tends to crack down on third-party sanctions avoiders. So how is it that you're still allowed to buy Russian oil as a Western nation through third-party providers?
Because it's different. I mean, the Indians have bought Russian crude, and then they've refined it in their refineries, and moreover, they've mixed it with Iranian oil and Saudi oil, and then they've turned it into petrol, and then they sell it back to Europe, and it counts as petrol. And the sanctions regime actually specifically, you know, once you change it, and even if you mix it, it ceases to be Russian oil. It becomes, you know, wherever it was mixed. But this is a moral problem. I mean, Joseph Borrell from the EU brought exactly this up and said we should ban Indian oil, which is actually Russian refined oil. But again, that doesn't work, because then you take it off the market completely, and then all the petrol prices would spike.
Right.
And so they're trying to balance this like, you know, punish Russia, reduce its income, but at the same time, keep the market supplied with regular amounts of oil, so we don't have these price spikes, because they boomerang back and hurt our economies more than they hurt the Russian economy.
Yeah. Victor, do you think there was ever a real chance for international sanctions to succeed as they wanted to collapse Russia's economy, or was there always going to be a way for Moscow to maneuver a way around the worst damage, as Ben has given examples of?
Well, first of all, the sanctions have not been introduced by the international community. They have not been approved by the United Nations. These are sanctions by the United States and its allies. around the world, and not all American allies are joining the sanctions regime. I could remind you that during the illegal Iraq war, not a single European country introduced sanctions against the United States. Abu Ghraib didn't cause a single European company to leave the American or the British market. And the same was true for Vietnam. So this is a lot more about geopolitical rivalry than about ethics and morals. Now, as far as your question about sanctions working, it depends on what one understands under the word, how one interprets the word working. If one believes that working means that the Russian economy is taking a hit, that the Russian economy is being weakened by the sanctions, sure, yes, of course, the Russian economy is being weakened by the sanctions. The sanctions regime is causing a number of problems in various sectors of the Russian economy. But if anyone expected that the sanctions regime would significantly alter or change Russia's foreign policy or Russia's actions in Ukraine, then of course that has not happened, and it is unlikely, very unlikely to happen. We see, if we look at other examples of sanctions regimes, such as Myanmar that you mentioned at the beginning of the program, or Iran that has been under sanctions for decades, or North Korea that has been under sanctions for decades, none of these countries changed their foreign or domestic policy significantly due to these sanctions regimes. So the way to end the bloody and tragic conflict in Ukraine is not through sanctions regimes that only widen the rift between Russia and the West. It's through compromise and negotiations.
Right. But listen, I'm going to ask this next question for all three of you. I want to get all of your sentiments on it, because the problem is some are arguing that the law of unintended consequences could apply here, and that it could backfire on the West by forcing Russia to become more innovative in creating its own alternative system, which the West could potentially be strengthening by insisting on sanctions and by insisting on trying to isolate Russia this way. And we have seen Russia get a bit innovative, because we've seen how they've been able to nationalize Western companies still in Russia, tax them like crazy, and gain some revenue that way, and in effect trap these companies so that they have to pay the Kremlin. I mean, we heard before that they should have made the right decision to get out in the first place, but they didn't. So now the Kremlin is able to reap those benefits. Svetlana, what do you make of that? Do you fear that there could be some unintended consequences here that could, in effect, strengthen Russia?
You know, geopolitics, it's not an easy thing to solve in 1 year, but I'm really very confident that the US and also UK and the EU have all means to cut Russia of all financial flows, being still flowing to feed Russia's war against us. And I think we are not just speaking about what Russia is doing internally, because it's insane. We are speaking about isolating Russia from the fossil fuel market forever, which could bring a lot more political perspectives to different countries, including developing, and end the war in Ukraine, but also end the climate crisis and the crisis of democracy. Because I just wanted to put one important issue here, which is about democracy and the new rise of fascism and far rights across the world, and the way how we all together defeat Putin and fossil-fueled Russia and keep their fossil fuels in the ground. The world future depends on that as well. And speaking about, I think with Russia, you can't make an estimations, or because you can not anticipate what is already happening. But I believe that sanctions were not imposed in the scale as they were needed to, but we still have time to do this. And we are calling to all the leaders who have all means in place to impose those sanctions on Russia. And what I know from Russian press, which I read from time to time, I can see it clearly that Russia is so much afraid of sanctions. they feel a huge economic impact on themselves, not just in always speaking openly about this impact. And actually, very last thing about infrastructure and technology, because West holds all the infrastructure and technology for oil and gas, and for Arctic LNG, and for LNG as well.
We're getting down to our last minutes. So yeah, I still want to talk about these potential unintended consequences, Ben, because you've said, and I'm quoting you, we're in an economic war, but we haven't committed our troops, and we're not prepared to take any casualties in the form of high prices for ourselves. So are Western consumers too ill-equipped or even too selfish to really adapt to what fits according to their own values, so that the sanctions will not be powerful enough and Russia, again, can kind of regroup and form what people on the planet are now considering this new kind of alliance and an alternative economic model that can make Russia stronger? Go ahead.
I mean, it's the point that Svitlana is trying to make, is that, we're not prepared to take the pain, because if we did completely kill Russia's ability to export oil, then that would cause an economic crisis on our side, and we'd have to pay not $5 at the pump for a gallon of gas, but 15 or 20, and no one's prepared to do that. And as for the sanctions themselves, I mean, what we're seeing, this new alliance, is that there's been an extraordinary remaking of the world's energy markets in the last 18 months. In so much as before this was one of the biggest, most efficient, truly global markets in the world. And suddenly, in order to get refined products in Europe, we're having to send Russian oil tankers to Gujarat in India, where it's refined and sent back, which is not efficient. But the bigger point is that Russia has successfully taken its entire export to the west, to Europe, and reorientated it and sent it to the east, to Asia specifically, China and India in particular, which is enormous, and it's introduced massive distortions. And this, of course, the much more expensive transport costs, because it's not efficient. Used to be from Primorsk to Rotterdam, Baltic Sea, a week in a ship, and now it's like 2 months, 4 months round trip. And again, it's been a huge, and it's at the cost of that, the cost of remaking these markets is being borne by the consumer. But in terms of sanctions and the pain on Russia, that it's eaten into its profit margin because of the increased costs. But it hasn't stopped it being profitable, nor has it stopped it earning hundreds of billions of dollars in revenues.
Right.
And so in that sense, the sanctions have completely failed.
Yeah, I mean, the Russian economy is actually set to grow. Not shrink, as Western powers had predicted. I mean, just very quickly, Ben, is this all set to continue on this same path now for the foreseeable future?
As far as the energy markets and sanctions are concerned, yes. In so much as the sanctions have run their course, and we've now imposed everything that we could do that would hurt Russia, and increasingly going forwards, the new sanctions that could be put in place, or making the ones that exist work better, more and more rebounds back onto the West. So Russia's looking at 2% growth when it's supposed to have collapsed. And you look here in Europe, and it's going into recession. And that's the boomerang effect that's going on. So in terms of using sanctions as a tool to end the war, I think it's run its course, and it's not been particularly effective.
Not been particularly effective. And Viktor, do you think it is backfiring in any way? Has it emboldened a new structure, alternative economic structure, that puts Russia in a unique position to continue to profit?
Well, look, a statement was made about acute economic pain that the Russians are feeling. Ukrainians are feeling even more acute economic pain. Is that changing their view of the military conflict? Is that making Ukrainians want to stop? No. What's important here is that whatever sanctions are introduced against Russia, Russia is not going to change course because of it. The Russian people are going to have to live on a more with less resources. But Russia has experienced that on multiple occasions in its history. It was predictable, and it's not a secret in Russia. And so this is not a zero-sum game. It's very unlikely, despite all the assistance, the military, economic, diplomatic, and media assistance that Ukraine is getting, it's very unlikely that Ukraine is going to be able to defeat a much larger military power, with a population 3 times as large as Ukraine's population, with a much larger mobilization potential anytime soon or ever. Okay. And so if we keep looking at this conflict as a zero-sum game, there is no solution. The solution is in negotiations.
Right.
The sooner they start, the sooner they come to a conclusion,
Svitlana,
the less Russians and Ukrainians are going to die.
I know you vehemently disagree, but unfortunately we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank all 3 of my panelists really so much for being with us. Svitlana, I apologize for not giving you a final word there. The clock is against us. Remember to follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.